Hear ye, hear ye. This card making session shall commence. I got a comment over on TikTok a couple of weeks ago asking for a medieval knight themed card, which seemed a little random at first, but then I remembered I had the exact perfect die for the occasion. So today I'm gonna make a medieval castle themed greeting card, but it wouldn't be in true Ralph Tyndall fashion if I didn't make it a little bit more complicated than it needs to be by adding my own kind of interactive twist to it. And by including a special hidden surprise within these castle walls. So stick around to see how I bring this enchanted creation to life, share a few techniques along the way, and reveal the hidden secrets within. Trust me, this is a good one. All right, we are gonna jump straight into making our card today. I'll explain the supplies as I go, but y'all don't really need me to do a full overview at the top of the video, do you? But the star of the show today is this Castle die and stencil set from Waffle Flower. So this is basically a full panel size die that looks like a castle, but it also comes with a coordinating stencil back here so that we can color in some of the detail for that castle. And I'm cutting our castle out using a light gray colored cardstock. This is in the color Granite from Hero Arts. And then while I have this die out, I'm also going to go ahead and run it through my die cutting machine again, but I'm just going to run it through so that I get these three little flags on top, and I'm going to cut these out in red. And voila, we have our three little flags cut out. I am just going to set these to the side for now. I will trim these down a little bit more here in a second. But first, I want to go ahead and bring our stencil out and add some additional detail to our castle front. And to do that, I'm going to bring out my grip mat just so that I can hold my cardstock and my stencil in place. And I know I talk about it a lot, but this grip mat is seriously one of those purchases. You know how every now and then you have one of those purchases in your life? It doesn't even have to be with crafting or card making related, but you have one of those purchases that after you use it for a while, you start to ask yourself, how did I exist without this? That is basically what this grip mat is for me. I can't imagine crafting without it. All right, so we have our stencil down. Now what I'm going to do is go in with a little bit of black soot distress ink. Now I'm going to use a very light, delicate hand here because I don't necessarily want these castle parts to be black, but I do want it to be a dark gray. So I'm going to pick up some of this black ink and then dab it off. Again, I don't want it to be super black, so I'm getting off some of that saturated ink there. And then I'm just with a light hand going to go in and start rubbing. I don't know why rubbing feels like the wrong word to use here. Brushing. And I should also mention I'm not really worried about the door, so don't worry about getting perfect coverage on the door, at least if you're following what I'm going to do. I'm actually going to turn this into an interactive card. This is not made to be an interactive die set, but if you know anything about me, I love making interactive cards, and so I have an idea for how to make this interactive. And what that is going to require is actually removing the store because I want to create my own wooden door and make it interactive so that you can pull a tab and pull the door open and reveal a little surprise inside the castle. All right, so that looks pretty good, but if you want to add even a little more detail, what you can do is pick up some black ink with a smaller brush. I'm using this 1+ shader brush. And where the towers meet, I'm just going to add a little bit of extra shading just to add a bit of a shadow effect there to give it a little bit more dimensionality. So I'm going to do that on these top two towers and then also on these lower bottom two towers. Now let's go ahead and remove our stencil. Beautiful, it looks perfect. Now remember, I'm going to cover these flags up with our little red cutouts here, so that's why I wasn't too worried about the shading there, and then we're also going to remove the door. So I'm going to go in with a tiny pair of scissors and just very carefully snip these flags apart, doing the same thing for all three. Whoops. And then I'm going to go in with a tiny bit of liquid glue on all three of these flags and just start placing them right where they belong. Now, if you wanted to, of course, you could also ink these, like use the stencil and use red ink through the stencil specifically for the flag pieces, but I thought it would be easier and just look better to do little cardstock pieces instead. All right, beautiful. We have a castle. Now let's carefully peel this up. We don't want to bend the cardstock because it is a little bit delicate. And then, like I said, I want to go ahead and remove this door. You can see that this door is actually cut out partially and then has a perforated line over here. So if you wanted to, you could keep the door and have it kind of open like a flap on your card. But I want to remove it entirely because I want the card to be even more interactive. But this looks good for now, so I'm going to go ahead and set this to the side, and we're going to get started on the background. Now for the background, this is actually not going to be anything new for you at all because I actually showed you this exact same product and technique in the last video. So this is the Cloud Lines Slimline stencil from Simon Says Stamp. And I'm just going to use this to create a nice blue sunny kind of background to go behind our castle. And for nice blue sunny skies, my favorite ink to use is always Salty Ocean. And then I'm just going to go in with my blending brush and apply some ink along that cloud line. Remember, you want the ink to be darker around the edge of the stencil and then kind of fade out to white. And then once you're fairly happy, you can go ahead and take your cardstock and then shift it to a different cloud line so that you can get a nice variety in your clouds. All right, so now we have our nice, pretty blue, cloudy background. The next thing I want to do is grab my castle and bring it back in. And this castle is going to lay right on top of this card front we just created. But before we glue it down, I want to take a pencil and then just very lightly draw the outline of this inner arch here. And once that's done, I'm going to take a pair of scissors and go ahead and cut this out. Now I am going to be mindful to either cut exactly on this line or a little bit outside of it because the castle is going to be laying on top of this paper. So if you leave some white edge on the inside of the line, that will show through, and we want to avoid that as much as possible. So if you're worried, I would err on the side of cutting too large rather than too small, because ultimately, if you cut a little too large, it's really not gonna make a difference at all. Okay, and then let's just test this out real quick, line it up, make sure we have nothing showing underneath. And I would say that's pretty good. All right, so I'm gonna take some tape runner and probably a little liquid glue as well. Just apply it all over the back of this castle, and then we're gonna glue it to our background that we just created. Ta-da! We now officially have the majority of our card front. Now, the part of this that I want to make interactive is actually the door. So I'm going to have a sheet of brown kind of behind the castle, like so. And I want to be able to make a pull tab so that the door opens and closes this way. But more on that in a second, because what I actually want to do first is I want to create something behind this doorway that becomes visible once the door opens. So it's a little bit of a hidden surprise for the recipient. And in order to do that, I'm actually going to stamp an image on the card base itself. So we need to create our card base. So what I have here is a 5.5 inch by 8.5 inch piece of cardstock. This is just a heavyweight 110-pound smooth white cardstock. And then using my scoreboard, I'm just going to score it right in the middle, right here at 4¼ inches. One of the nice things about these Scor-Buddies or Scor-Pals is they have a lot of the common measurements already marked for you. For instance, you can kind of see this asterisk mark here right at 4¼ because that is probably the score mark that you will use the most. Now I'm going to go ahead and fold it over, give it a quick burnish with my bone folder just to reinforce that crease. And now we have our card base. Now, what am I going to do with my card base? Great question. Let me show you. So like I mentioned, we're going to do some stamping. So I'm going to bring out my MISTI. I have my waffle flower grip mat right back inside of it. I'm going to place my card base right here in the middle. And then since we're stamping and this is a folded piece of cardstock, I'm also going to grab just a little bit of mint tape to help hold that card front down so that we don't get any uh-ohs while we're stamping. And you know what, I'm going to add one to the bottom as well for good measure, just because we will be stamping on the bottom, so that's probably where it's going to get the most force. Now remember, we're going to have our castle here on the front, right? So our stamped image has to be in this little arch. And what I'm going to use for this stamped image actually comes from a stamp set called Magical Birthday that is part of this same release. And I want to use this little knight guy riding off on his horse. And the entire stamped image is a little bit big for this opening, but what I want to do is just offset it a little bit to the right. So it really looks like he's, coming out of the castle. And then I'm going to take my MISTI door, pick the stamp up. We can also go ahead and set this back to the side because we don't want to stamp on top of our castle, right? And then I'm going to stamp our knight in this Memento Tuxedo Black dye ink. And I'm using dye-based ink because I'm going to go in and color our stamped image with alcohol markers. If you used, say, a pigment ink and you go in with alcohol markers, your black lines are going to smudge and smear and not be pretty. So if you're using alcohol markers with your stamped images, make sure you're using a dye-based ink. And voila, we now have a handsome little knight ready to ride out of the castle. Let's go ahead and color him. As I said, I'm going to be coloring our knight with alcohol markers, and I like to use the Ohuhu Honolulu B series, which has a brush tip on one end and a fine tip on the other end. Now, I'm probably going to speed this section up because I cannot talk and color at the same time to save my life, but I did grab quite a few markers over here, and I will do my best to put all of the color codes on the screen as I color. All right, y'all, we have a completed colored knight on his horse here. Probably not the best coloring in the world, but you know what? It's fine. You'll notice that I went out of the lines a little bit here and there, had a little bit of an oopsie, but that's actually not much of a problem, and I will tell you why, because we're not done yet. So we have this knight on a white background, but it doesn't really make sense to have a white background, right? Because he's coming out of the castle. So what I want to do is actually make this background a nice dark gray to kind of match the interior of the castle, which to do that, we're going to need to ink blend around our colored knight. Now you might be asking yourself, how are we going to do that? And I will show you. It's a little bit tedious, but I think the results are worth it. Of course, you could also go in with a colored pencil or an alcohol marker and color the background if you wish. I don't feel that talented with coloring backgrounds. I like to have a stamped image that I'm coloring in, you know what I mean? So I'm going to do perhaps what is the easy way for me, but is maybe the more difficult way for you. So choose your own adventure here. Now, what I'm going to do is take a scrap piece of cardstock, and then I'm going to grab my large roll of mint tape here. You could also use something like Masking Magic or any type of masking tape, really, and just place that on top of my cardstock. And then I'm going to take the exact same stamp. So this is the same knight stamp that we used here, but I'm just hand stamping it here because I don't really care too much about any precise placement. I just want to get it on top of the masking tape. Now, this is the tedious part. So what we're going to do next is I'm going to go in with a small pair of scissors, and I am going to cut this entire image out, just going right up against the stamped line. Now, the reason this in particular is tedious is because you'll notice that this guy, it's a pretty irregular shape, right? But that in itself is a little difficult. What's more difficult is we have these little interior pieces like between his body and the horse that we want the background to shine through there too. We also have another piece similar to that right here between his arm and his helmet. And I can't really get in there with a pair of scissors, so what I'm going to need to do is actually go in there with an X-Acto knife to get those pieces out. So like I mentioned, I'm not trying to oversell this. This technique that I'm doing right now is a little tedious, but totally doable. Okay, so through the power of our tiny pair of scissors and an X-Acto knife, we got our guy all cut out. Now, after all of that work, you still have one more step that you need to be extremely careful with, and that is we're actually going to peel this masking tape up off of the cardstock that we originally put it on. Now, one way I like to do this is go in with a die pick, or you could probably even, oh no, okay, I just pierced. See, this is hard to show you and do at the same time, but I like to go in with a die pick and just kind of run it around the masked image, just kind of releasing it. Do you see how it's between the cardstock and the mint tape right now? And that's going to be a lot more effective than you just going in here and trying to rip it up. Now, typically when I use this method of masking, I don't actually do images this delicate because it gets pretty difficult, but I thought it was worth it in this particular case. Okay, voila, we have it all off in one piece, and now the last tedious step, and then I promise the rest of the card is quite simple, is we want to line this up with our stamped image and place it down directly on top. Something like so. I think that's pretty good. And then since I did pierce the middle of my mask, I am going to add just a tiny little piece over that hole. I don't think any ink would seep through, but after all that work, we might as well be extra careful, right? And then I'm going to grab my black soot ink once again and just ink blend right over that masked image. I tapped off a little bit of excess off camera, and then I'm just going to lightly go in and add some ink. Okay, so once you're done with the ink blending, it should look something like this, and now we can take our mask off. If you imagine yourself making multiple of these, maybe peel your mask off carefully so that you can reuse this, or if you think you're done, you know, just go ahead and rip it. Who cares? But I guess maybe I shouldn't tell you. I probably shouldn't tell you to do that actually because you want to preserve your project as much as possible. Oh no, you can see my mask wasn't perfect. I have a few little white spots poking out, but oh gosh, okay. Well, you can see, even after all that work, I didn't get it perfect, but you could go in with a little black colored pencil and color those in. In fact, I think that's what I'm gonna do. I honestly cannot believe I did that. I thought I did such a good job at masking. Clearly, I missed some spots. Okay, I do think that looks better, and to the untrained eye, I don't think they would ever know any different. And remember, this half the horse is going to be covered up anyway, so I think we're safe. Although, let me add just a little touch more around his helmet. Now, as I said, the rest of the card will be fairly simple, but it does require some math. Also, do you see how much better that looks without the white background? It all looks a little bit more cohesive now. Let's go ahead and start on this door that I've been talking nonstop about. Now, remember, this is not an interactive die set, but I'm gonna make it interactive very easily with a piece of cardstock and a little bit of foam tape, I promise. It's super simple. So what you're gonna do is grab a piece of cardstock. I'm using brown because I want my door to have kind of a wooden look, and you want it to be 3 inches wide. The length or height doesn't really matter. You just want to make sure that it's taller than your card so that you have some peeking out to use as a pull tab. I'm going to end up trimming this down, but just make sure it's longer than your card and 3 inches wide. That's the important part. And then what you're going to do with it is grab your card front, turn it over, put your strip of cardstock in the middle, and then just to keep it in place, I am going to add a little bit of mint tape. You don't really have to do this step, but it does make your life a little easier. And then what I want you to do is if you have a ruler, I want you to mark 1/4 of an inch from the edge of your strip of cardstock on one side, and then do the same exact thing on the other side. And then going vertical, I want you to measure 1/2 inch up and make a mark there as well. And again, same thing on the other side. So you should have something that looks like this. 1/4 of an inch in and 1/2 inch up on both sides. And then go ahead and take your scissors and you're basically just going to cut until those two lines meet each other. So 1/2 inch or 1/4 of an inch in, 1/2 inch up, and then do the same thing on the other side. Now ideally these should mirror each other, and match. Unless you measured exactly perfect, they may not. And you know what? That's okay. Now what you're going to do is here where you have this little notch, take your ruler and put the bottom of it there at the base of the notch. I'm probably not using the right terminology here, but you know what I mean. And we're going to do another mark at 1/2 inch. And then once again, do the same thing on this side. Now, what I'm going to do is bring out my paper trimmer. And for this, I'm going to use my guillotine trimmer. It honestly would probably be easier to use a precision trimmer, one of those ones that has the blades that slides, but this is what we're using today. And basically what I want to do is I want to cut a straight line all the way down on each side to meet that mark that we made. So we end up just having 2 little notches sticking out here. So what I'm going to do, and hopefully you can see this, is I'm going to line this little guy up in my guillotine trimmer. I'm going to line the paper up so that our little notch here just meets the edge of the blade. That way I know that the cut that I'm about to do is going to line up with this notch that we already have down here at the bottom. And then I'm going to go ahead and slice that, but being careful not to slice it all the way to the end because we don't want to slice off that notch, right? And then once that's done, you can just go ahead and finish it off with your scissors. And then we're just going to do the exact same thing on this side. Bring it down, be careful not to go all the way down. And the reason I'm using a guillotine trimmer is because I know I'll get a straighter cut than I would just using scissors. And since this is going to turn into a slider mechanism, we do want the edges to be as straight as possible just because it's going to make the interactive piece a lot easier for you. All right, so now you should have something that looks like this, and I promise we are finally in the home stretch. If you wanted to, you could just go ahead and use this as your door and just have a plain front. But what I'm going to do is actually add a little bit more detail, and I'm going to do that by using a die. And I'm not going to use the die in the traditional sense. I'm actually going to be using this metal die to emboss, which, believe it or not, is something that I always knew you could do, but I had never actually tried it until last week. And I think I've unlocked a new obsession with it. So for those of you who may be unaware, you can actually use any of your metal dies, not just to cut, but to actually emboss with. So this is a wood grain panel die that I have from Hero Arts, which typically all of these little lines in here would cut a wood pattern into a piece of cardstock. But today I actually just want to use it to impress this pattern into the cardstock without actually making any cuts. And believe it or not, yes, you can do that. So what you're going to do is you're going to put your base platform down, and then have your thin adapter platform down as well. And then you're actually going to put your cutting die face up and place your cardstock on top of it. And then the big difference here is in the plates you put on top. So we're actually going to put this kind of flexible, I think it's silicone plate on top. And this actually comes standard with your Platinum 6 if you buy that. I believe if you have a Sizzix Big Shot, you can buy them as an additional add-on. And then I'm also going to put this last adapter plate, which is a hard, not see-through plate on top. Now, we crank. And would you look at that? We have an embossed piece of cardstock, no cuts, didn't make any cuts into the cardstock, but we have this beautifully embossed pattern on our soon-to-be door. Now, if you want to add a little bit more dimensionality to your door, like I do, I am going to go ahead and brush on a little bit of ground espresso distress ink. And I'm not being too particular about this, I'm just kind of rubbing it on. And since we have an embossed textured piece of cardstock now, the ink is going to kind of naturally settle along the texture and just kind of add some additional pop. I know that's probably a terrible explanation, but trust me, it works. All right, it is finally time to assemble this card, y'all. And the assembly, after all of that work we've done, is actually really easy. So you're going to go ahead and line your door piece up in the middle of your card front like we did earlier. And then if you're happy with the placement, again, try to get it in the middle as much as you can. We're going to go in with some foam tape, and this is 1/2 inch foam tape, and I believe 1/8 of an inch tall. And that's the reason I wanted you to do 1/2 inch from the bottom, because we're actually going to put a little piece of foam tape right under that notch on both sides of the door piece. And what this is going to do is it's really just acting as a stopper. So whenever we slide the door down, those little notches are going to hit this foam tape and basically keep the door piece from, falling all the way through the card. Now, it also works the opposite way, right? So when we pull this door piece up, we also want these little notches to stop up top. So we're gonna need some foam tape here at the top as well. But this one's not as simple as just adding a notch of foam tape here. We're actually going to take a longer piece of foam tape. I'm just eyeballing this. I'm sorry, I'm not giving you exact dimensions, but we're actually gonna place it long ways like this. So it's gonna do two things. A, it's gonna act as a stopper. So whenever that little notch hits the foam tape, it's not gonna go up any further. But lengthwise, we're going to have a piece on each side, and that's actually going to act as the track that this piece is running on. So that's going to keep this door piece moving nice and smooth and stay in line. And if you're wondering where to stop the door, it's kind of personal preference. I want to stop it so that a little bit of the door is still poking out whenever it stops, so you can see this tiny little piece here. I think that that is quite cute. And the way I'm going to mark this is I'm going to move the door to about where I would like it. And then I'm going to mark this top notch here on both sides and then place this back down. And the reason I'm doing this is because, as you can imagine, if I push this up and then tape it, it's very possible this would have shifted by the time I moved it up. But if I leave it down, but have those spots marked, now I know exactly where my track can be. And you can see I did shift it a little bit. This mark is way over here. And then we'll just do the same thing on the other side. And you end up with something like this. Now, when it comes to actually placing this on your card base, it can be a little scary, right? Because none of this stuff is really secure. So you don't want to peel off your foam tape and then your door accidentally shift and get stuck in the foam tape and then, oh, it's a mess. So here's something you can do. I'm actually going to go ahead and take these off. And if you want to add a little bit of security in that department I was just talking about, what you can do is take a piece of paper. I would probably not suggest cardstock just because I wouldn't want to add any extra thickness to the card at this point. So I'm actually using a piece of copy paper here. And I'm just kind of cutting this down to size. And I'm actually going to place this over our strip here. So this kind of will act as some added insurance to keep it in place. But of course we did cover up our adhesive here, so now I'm going to go in and add more adhesive on the back. But at this point, we should feel pretty secure, right? So we can move that up. That won't be in the way. Go ahead and remove these. And now we stack. And as you know by now, here on my channel, I like to use my scoreboard to help me make sure I line up my card fronts nice and square. Ta-da! And look at that. It moves effortlessly, flawlessly, all of the above. Now, obviously, it has a really long handle here, but that's an easy fix. I would just take my paper trimmer, figure out how long you want it to be. I usually leave like 1/4 of an inch, maybe 1/2 of an inch if I'm feeling generous, but you can just kind of eyeball it, and then whoop, there it goes. So you get something like that. And then to really polish it off, I always like to round the corners of my interactive pieces. So I'm going to go in here with a corner rounder and just snip these two corners so I have a nice finished edge. And there you go. We have a fully completed interactive card that we made all ourselves. We didn't use any interactive dies. Now, obviously, you can take this up a notch by adding some sentiments or other elements. In fact, I have a version here I want to show you. You can see I added a little congratulations banner here across the front. This isn't part of the same release. I actually believe I grabbed this from a Concord 9th set. I will leave that link down in the description, along with all the other products I used today. But I thought that it really fit the vibe of this card. You can also see that I wrote out pool up here in a white gel pen so the recipient knows, you know, pool. There's a hidden little surprise down here for you. And then on the inside, I also added "You Slayed the Day." I had a really difficult time actually thinking of sentiments that go with medieval castle themed. And this one makes me cringe a little bit, but I do think it's cute. And I actually just used my Cricut to create that. So that's not a stamp. I used my Cricut. But yeah, that is an example of a way that you could dress this card up, should you so choose. All right, if you made it all the way to the end of the video, thank you. Y'all are some real ones. This is actually probably my favorite card that I've made in a while, masking aside. I should also mention that the makers of this Castle die and stencil set, Waffle Flower, has agreed to give all of you a very limited time discount code. So if you use code Ralph at checkout, you'll get 10% off of any of the items included in that kind of castle medieval themed release, and I'll leave all that information linked down in the description. And if you enjoyed this video, I think you'll also probably like this video over here where I created 3-dimensional waves on paper. I know, sounds a little weird, but I promise, well, I think it's pretty cool anyway. And if you haven't given this video a like yet, I encourage you to do so. It helps out the channel and really means a lot to me. But most importantly, I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I will catch you on the next one. Bye, y'all.